D&D Adventures, how to write the best D&D adventure book.
Trapped in every corner, swaying sides of misery. Roll your dice if you dare, but don't come crying to me. Orcs are slaying elves, the greenskins don't know peace. Goblin heads on shelves, someone call the TMG.
What makes the best D&D adventures?
Yeah, when I think about my favorite games that I've played, I think of three things that really pull me into the adventure, and that's mystery, and this is going to sound weird, but limitations, and a kind of a mix of realism with fantasy. So I can run through those real quick. With mystery, I like where the players are just plopped into a scenario where they're not really sure what's going on. They're not sure who to trust. They're not sure who the good guy is, or if it's more of like a lesser of two evils. Usually I think the most interesting games have someone who really is more at fault. You know, nobody's pure and completely innocent, but the players have got to figure out who is better to ally themselves with, who is less at fault in whatever is exploding around them. And so that's a kind of a mystery angle that I really like. I think those are the most compelling games. You're not really sure who to trust. But in tension with that, I think a good game master always lets the players know what the objective is in each game session. Some clearly defined goals. We need to know what the limits are. What can my character do? And what are we trying to accomplish? Professor Dungeon Master says that should be clear in the first 5 or 10 minutes of the game. And I really believe that too. I'm a big fan of actual playthroughs on YouTube. So I like to watch actual people, not just the voice actors. And those are really fun. But if I have a critique, it would be that some of those actual playthroughs don't really get started until maybe the third or fourth episode. Things drag out a little too long before before they realize what this adventure is supposed to be. So our time is so limited in real life that I want to get to the interesting bits quickly. I want to get to that. So I think we should let the players know what they're in for. And then the mix of realism with fantasy. I think that no matter how immersive you try to be with your world setting, if you, let's say, want to have a low fantasy or low magic environment, you should blend that with the fun factor. You know, there's a lot of really cool systems like Harnmaster or the ones that kind of attempt to expose you to the Middle Ages. And whatever system you've got, I think you can, even the low fantasy ones can be very enthralling in terms of just the Middle Ages culture. It's so defamiliarizing from our everyday lives that that's a kind of enchantment unto itself. But whatever your level of verisimilitude, I think you've got to put a premium on fun. You know, what Jeremy Holcomb, a game designer, calls effective fun, where the return on investment is really high. The time that you spend at the table playing should be in a real positive ratio to the amount of time that you put into learning the rules, setting up the pieces, figuring out how the game works. You know, for every 15 minutes of prep, there should be a couple of hours of really fun time at the table. So if you're going to err on the side of realism versus gonzo funhouse stuff, I kind of think you need to let the players do the crazy thing, figure out a way that it makes sense somehow in the world. And so those are the three things that I like: the mystery, the limits, and the fun factor.
Well, sort of the enemy of art is the absence of limitations, which is a great quote from Orson Welles. You know, there's a guy who made basically the best movie ever made when it was his first film and he was 21, you know, and he could never reach that again. That is really, I think, the takeaway here is that less is more in terms of prep. And I think when you were talking about goals, you shouldn't be actually verbalizing it to the players. Your goal is to go and get the chalice, right? It should come from their interactions with the environment. There should be an NPC who lets slip that there's this golden chalice that that protects the realm or something, that's missing.
Yeah.
That it shouldn't be a direct, like, your quest is to do this. I hate games like that. I can't.
Yeah.
It's like, why are you telling me? Like, because that is actually railroading, because you've taken away my agency, because I want to ask the NPCs questions. I want to figure out how this place works, how this world works, etc. And I think that's a very, very important place to start with. Now, we started collaborating on this module, which is Slay the Hawker, which you can have a little talk about how we actually went through initially and started all of this. Because basically what we're doing with that is what Scotty and I do with all the Quest Givers modules, is we approach it very differently to the way that other people work. And I think my struggle was always, if I picked up a module book from any other publisher, it's just a collection of a giant mess that I have to try and string together in some logical way. And I feel like it's very easy to just put ideas onto paper, right? You can just vomit out all kinds of cool ideas. Oh, there's some rat men, and there's a secret society, and there's a chalice, and there's, a fork in the road, and whatever. But how on earth do you connect all of this together, right? And then when you're presented, like you presented with these cool kind of characters, here's a list of all their armor and everything, but you got no idea of their actual personality. How would they actually speak? What kind of language would they use? Will they be speaking in like a broken kind of English or a common? Would they be mixing in some foreign words that you won't understand? These are the sort of things that make the world real and interesting. And that's what's severely lacking from other things. So if you take anything away from this, if you're going to be writing any kind of modules for anything, it doesn't have to be D&D, think about the NPCs and who they are, because my whole philosophy is that's how you build the world, is through the NPCs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those goals have got to be discoverable, early on, if the players want to take the bait. They ought to have plenty of chances to do that. Yeah, exactly.
And even when you're playing, when you're describing a scene, every scene needs to be able to set goals for the characters as well. So it's not just the beginning and then, okay, well, I can rest on my laurels now. They're on the quest and I can just railroad them to the end. No, you've got to do every single little event that happens has to also adhere to this when you're actually putting it all together. So my question then is, from these publishers that publish these things, these tomes of collections of ideas that are unconnected, in my opinion, obviously, why do people actually buy these modules?
For, like I was saying, the reason I've always been drawn to modules, the earliest TSR ones to me are treasures. Even if they're kind of like recipe books, they're a treasure trove of inspiration, and they may be kind of tedious to read, but I like them. Today's modules, they're a lot different in tone, and especially the 5th edition ones, they're high fantasy or heroic or whatever. The greater emphasis on narrative structure for modules instead of kind of the open world flavor of the early ones. I think it's because in real life, it's really hard to, for me anyway, take my players just through a romp and let them wander aimlessly until we stumble on something interesting. I don't have time to just stumble into some interesting adventure hoping that we take the snow globe and shake it up and hope the sediment settles into some interesting pattern for us. I need to know where this is going as the GM, and I need to throw down hooks that they can latch onto so that we can get to those interesting parts with the time that we've got. The time is our precious commodity in game and in real life. I want to get to the good parts. I don't want to just drag it out and hope we eventually have some interesting quest,
You see it in modern media and television. especially now, where it takes them 3 or 4 episodes to kind of just get to the point. There's a few examples where it kind of just goes and it's amazing. You know, Stranger Things did that. It kind of just bang from the first episode. You know, it hit the ground running, and that was really, really good. But a lot of things, especially the big failures, which I won't mention, but you'd know what they are. You know, it's a slow burn. It's like an 8-episode series. And really, it only gets interesting around maybe 7th or 8th episode. And there might be some little interesting sort of setups along the way, but nothing to really actually, if you're a casual viewer and you're like, what is this? And you start to watch it, it's like, this is boring. Nothing's happening.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you don't fall into that trap. A lot of people fall into the trap of over-designing the characters and under-designing the plot. You know, and it doesn't have to be plot as in railroad. I'm talking about plot as in events that happen in a proto-narrative. So a proto-narrative being a narrative that happens before the actual story. It's a thing that from which the story evolves. So you're just dropping events in front of the players who will react to those events, and then the world reacts to what the players do before the next event happens. That's essentially how I see how TTRPGs actually work. But what would you say are some great adventure story examples?
So I'm a big Appendix N type of reader. So some of the earliest entries on that list for me were the Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter of Mars books. And I just latched onto those and I've reread them. I just think it doesn't get much better. There's so much dungeon crawling in there. You've got this Civil War captain who gets transported to the planet of war. He's got his close comrade, Thars Tarkas, the green man with 4 arms and tusks. Their backs to the wall, fighting hordes of enemies to protect the honor of the Princess of Helium, the incomparable Dejah Thoris, you know, and he's a fighter, not a lover, you know, says he would rather be fighting the hordes with his saber than smelling a perfumed glove. And there's all this chivalry, yet there's also these escapades. He's constantly getting trapped and he has to fight his way out of slavery from the pits of Barsoom. And you have all these races, the yellow men, the red men, the black men, the green men. They're weird. There's a high tone of seriousness. It's deadly serious. I love that. In fact, I've just gotten into Michael Moorcock, the Elric saga, and he's a big Burroughs fan. He wrote a tribute of 3 Mars adventures that are in that vein. So those are also good. But I really like Jack Vance. I know The Dying Earth is really famous, that series, and I can't wait to see what Dungeon Crawl Classics makes out of that. I find that good, but it's almost like a parody, in at least the Eyes of the Overworld, which I've read. To me, the Lioness trilogy it's got everything that you would want in a D&D campaign. It's got these factions of sorcerers who jealously guard their esoteric lore. They go visit other planes of existence. They make constructs to deploy against each other. You've got the protagonist, Ialos, who is another figure who's got to fight his way out of the pits of slavery, go on a hex crawl with this band of misfits and seize his throne back, and then go to war against a crooked king. And there's all along the way, Jack Vance has all these delightful taverns with the aromas of the sizzling meats and delicacies that just make your mouth water. He's just a great American author. He's got a very good vocabulary for an American, you know. He's very inventive. You just see the stamp of influence on Gary Gygax and those early game developers in the Jack Vance. It's not just the magic system, but there's a moment near the end of the first novel. I do admit they are an acquired taste, and you got to get past the first 80 pages before it really takes off. But once you're in there, I couldn't put it down. There are some things it was the era of pulp fantasy, so it's going to trigger some people. So I got to warn you about that, you know, but it is just high epic fantasy. And near the end of that first book, there's this wizard named Shimrod, and he comes forth against his foe and says, I am an enchanter of the 11th level. So it's just a D&D epic par excellence. So he's high on my list. And I also think there in Appendix N, it mentions Powell Anderson. And I got to say, Three Hearts and Three Lions is one of those textbook D&D campaigns. I mean, it just reads like the kind of adventure you've always wanted to play. Yeah, the Conan, everybody talks about Robert E. Howard. The Red Citadel is just a textbook dungeon crawl. Those are great adventures. And I just think that the best stories have got what Tolkien says. You know, you don't set out as a knight errant without packing your provisions. A good author is going to have what I think you call, Gareth, those transitions, those segue moments between the intense scenes.
Well, I'm a different kind of beast when it comes to that sort of thing. I love those sort of, you know, those sort of pulp fantasy and pulp science fiction and that sort of stuff. But I'm more of a visual media, inspired by visual media, and so I always say the endless wells are things like Star Trek, the A-Team, Knight Rider. Now, you can say what you like in terms of, if you rewatch those things now, they're very camp and silly and whatever. But undeniably, the A-Team, if every single episode is a D&D, you could play a D&D game as that episode of the A-Team. You got four dudes, could be girls as well, doesn't matter. four people against a very well-defined evil enemy, and it's having to come up with crazy shenanigans to get the job done. Undeniably, every A-Team episode is, you could basically just go through that and write down everything that happens in each episode, and you could run each one of those as a session, and you can thank me later.
And you got each member of the team who's a specialist, and they're indispensable. You know, Face has got all the charisma, and you got the muscle with B.A. Baracus. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So, like, when I started playing D&D, like, that's immediately, yes, I'm just playing the A-Team in a dungeon against skeletons and goblins. That's really like how I like to approach it. It's like, okay, the well that never stops giving is Star Wars, the first 3 films, not episodes 1 through 3, episodes 4 through 6. Even things that you wouldn't think would be helpful, but Law and Order or Law and Order Special Victims Unit, things like that. Every one of those episodes, there's like a problem that needs to be solved, you know, and you've got a team that goes at it, you know, from different directions and with different specialties and so on and so forth. CSI, you know, it's like they're all just D&D parties getting the job done. Obviously, you know, a lot of those, they stick around one specific location. And I think that's why the A-Team is better, because they're roaming around constantly being chased by the military, which has a great like little backstory of, like, you know, you're being constantly chased by the Knights of the Realm, you know, for crimes you didn't commit. And so one of the most recent modules we put out on Quest Givers was Mountain Mayhem, where it is you basically are thrown in prison for a crime you didn't commit, and then you've got to do a dirty dozen. It's basically the dirty dozen. You got to go to this enemy territory, get the map, and get back, destroying the secret weapon. Right? It's just the dirty dozen. That's where you can look at media in its entirety. So not just books, not just films, but it's sort of across the entire landscape. Computer games, doesn't really matter. You can mine all of those things for great ideas, and you can just wholesale lift the entire plot. Just change the location and the names, and they won't know. They won't know.
Like you've said before, like you can take your favorite stories like that and kind of reskin them, and most people will never realize you're doing that. And it reminds me of what Tom Shippey, famous Tolkien scholar, has said about the creative method of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. He calls it writing in the gaps. So Lewis and Tolkien were fond of taking their favorite stories and picking them apart to see where they went wrong, where they thought they got this part all wrong. And they would just rewrite them stopping those gaps and correcting the mistakes so that the story would proceed the way they thought it should go. For me, that's kind of what you're describing with these influential films, these pioneer from the early 80s. Like Hawk the Slayer has been close to my heart my whole life. It has defined so much of my taste. I mean, I liked it immediately when I was a kid. I mean, the ridiculous special effects that weren't so special, you know, the stop motion, you know, fast firing.
That's my
of the
favorite part, the arrows.
Yeah, I mean, it's just classic. And it came out before the first Conan movie. So it was kind of the first sword and sorcery flick of that era. And it was perfect. It was like Lord of the Rings in miniature. You got one elf, one dwarf, you've got a witch, you've got a one-armed crossbowman, you've got a giant, and then you've got this Luke Skywalker in medieval leather gear, you know. And the thing that they did right with that story is they kept it small. The cast, it's all these classically trained actors. I guess they were on holiday, and you know they had the woods outside the studio, and they said, "Hey, you got anything going on? We're making a movie out here. Jack Palance is here." But it's not saving the universe. You know, for many years, I've been so tired of these movies and stories about multiverses and these epic battles of good versus evil. We got to save the world again. I'm glad I'm hearing more of a trend these days. I'm glad to hear more people saying this, that you need to, for your D&D games, to keep it small and local. Don't start your campaign mapping out the whole globe and with all your calendars and all. You know, start with a village, because that's in Hawk the Slayer. All you have to do, they have to just save the abbess who got kidnapped and she's being held for ransom. It's the local church. It's the evil brother. And you got to stop him with this little band of merry men. And that's it. It's beautiful.
The A-Team.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to go out and find these guys and get your crew together.
So that brings us to, you know, you and I and Scotty are collaborating on this module, Slay the Hawker, which is obviously an homage to Hawk the Slayer. But, you know, we've changed it up, and we've done various different things to make it something unique and new. Obviously, when you were presenting this with us, I had not actually seen Hawk the Slayer. I thought I had, because I've seen a lot of films, and yeah, I've seen a lot of that sort of stuff. And it's one of those ones I'd actually missed, having been brought up in Africa, where we just didn't have access to everything. You just you had like snippets of stuff. Then I did actually watch it, and I could see where the passion for the material comes from, because there are lots and lots of like little things in it that really, once globbed together, forms a great experience. And I think that's, for me, it was the takeaway of like why this module would work, is because it has all those little elements and events that happen that can actually make it a very entertaining thing to do. So why don't you take us through how to actually write a D&D adventure? Because you've actually gone through the experience of, you went to try and do it a traditional way, and then I came along and screwed it up.
So I had made a computer text adventure as a sequel, because they tried to do a sequel in like 2015 to Hawk the Slayer, and it was going to be called Hawk the Hunter. And I took the premise, that the kind of backbone of a story, and that project fell through. I took it and just went with it. But I thought, after I fleshed out that huge, it turned out to be a gargantuan computer text adventure. It's like an RPG on steroids. It's like Zork, but it's an RPG. But I thought it would really be fun to play this at the table. So that one, the computer game that I made, is a sequel. What we made is a prequel. And again, I'm writing in that method that I described as writing in the gaps, because the Hawk the Slayer original is so promising. It's so enticing. I mean, there's this guy with the last elven mind sword. What a cool idea. It flies. It's like a lightsaber, but it's medieval. but I don't think they capitalized on that quite enough. There's so much more cool stuff that you could do with that. And the film has some interesting gaps that don't get explained. And those are your opportunities as a writer and a game designer. Like we've Hawk at the very beginning, his dying father, and then his brother, who's old enough to be his father, killing their dad to try to take this relic that ought to be his by birthright. And I know it's just because Jack Palance is a little older as an actor, but I want things to make sense. So I'm going to write that again, and I'm going to try to write a prequel that explains the sibling rivalry and why Voltan is not eligible for his birthright. And where's the mom? We never even hear about that. And why is nobody using a shield in this entire adventure? Like, everyone's got a huge sword, or name your weapon, but nobody's got proper armor. It looks cool, but that's an opportunity. I can write that into the world building. So I think when you write in the gaps that way, it unleashes all kinds of creativity to make up your own story that's intriguing in different ways. Yeah, I approached you guys with this, and I was going to take that computer game and make it into a tabletop. But, conferring with you, Gareth, you just said you encouraged me to just totally rework it. And that's where I kind of decided to make it a prequel. And then collaborating with you was a delight, because that was another layer of world building. And through the NPC dialogues, I really think that it really got more dynamic. It'll be more interactive for the game master. It's more fun to prep for the adventure that way. I don't know, just the synergy that I got as we went back through and made certain scenes more. I mean, as you said, every scene is interactive, and you brought a lot of that to it.
Yeah, I mean, initially I was just the editor, but I started to inject things into it. And as a person who's written film scripts and things like that, and edited a lot of film scripts and read a lot of film scripts for other people to give my thoughts on and things like that, when I don't see dialogue, I don't know how the local populace feels about things. And in my How to Be a Dungeon Master video, I talk about NPCs are the way you actually build your world. So you can describe a castle to the nth degree, and it's like it means nothing to the players until they're talking to the guard at the gate. And you can reveal how the rest of the populace feels through a single person. Just into, are they grumpy? Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they miserable? Are they, what are they? But then, because GMs are not given these sort of details in normal modules, like, what do you say? How do you do that? And I think that's where the dialogue is important, especially when you've got a specific world, and so the characters need to speak in a specific way. And what's great with your background, especially you've had a lot of sort of old and middle English experience, so you will understand a lot of sort of the parlance of the time. And the way that people would speak, and the cadence and the kind of verbiage and, that sort of thing that they would use. And so it adds a lot more flavor to it than the way I would write, which is more sort of a modern interpretation of it. Now, I've studied Chaucer and all those sort of things, but to me, it's like that's way inaccessible to the norm. That screwed up all my spelling. But
and that's one of the charms of the original film too. I think that Harry Robertson, who did the soundtrack, I suspect he's responsible for the quasi-Elizabethan tone, the dialect in the movie, and that's one of the charms of it. So many sword and sorcery movies just update all of the dialogue so that everybody talks in a modern way, but the actors, it's completely campy and silly, but they do it straight-faced, and they do it with this, not quite like Yoda speak, but it's, when next the moon is full and all that kind of thing. And so I wanted some of that, but, also we need a variety of voices. And I really like how you've got a whole set of different I dialects to bring in there, and that's also important
Yeah.
to the adventure. For a while, when we were collaborating in the process, sometimes I would be like, "Oh my gosh, he wants so much dialogue. How am I going to do this?" But I realized as we pushed through it that it was, like you said, it helped me to see how the GM or the reader is going to read the material and think, "Whoa, that was a weird reference. What's that about?" So they're probably going to ask an NPC to say more about that. And that prevents it from being an info dump where the GM spends the first hour. I've been to so many game cons where they actually spend a full hour telling you about this whole huge world that they're so proud of, that they've, you know,
and it's a simple fix. It's a simple fix. Say those things through the mouths of the people that live there. I mean, it's so simple. I don't understand why people don't do it.
Yeah, and as the GM reads it this way, it kind of wires their mind as they're prepping for the adventure to think in terms of interactivity. Like, you're going to say what the players are interested in. You know, you're going to react to the players instead of, you know, dominating.
Well, when we first started, like, you know, obviously you weren't used to writing dialogue in this way, so, you know, you would be like, okay, here's 3 subjects that the person talks about, and you would write the lines, and then I would pick out like 7 or 8 keywords and say, okay, well, you got to talk about this. I'm now, as the editor of this, I'm now intrigued. What does this mean? Who's this guy?
Yeah.
What happened there? Because I'm the player, and I'm like, well, if someone talks about a dark sword, I want to know all about the dark sword. You're not going to get away with not telling me about the dark sword, Mr. Blacksmith.
Yeah. And that just released even more intriguing content as a result of that. So it all helped the world building.
And I mean, 80% of the stuff that's in it, you probably will not see as a player because you may not go down a certain route. But you as the GM, you when we talk about mining material, you immediately see that you can create depth in your game just by thinking about characters and then dropping in these keywords, and you're subtly hinting at what players can do rather than just sort of forcing them down a specific path. And then you're just dropping these events in front of them where, lo and behold, when you talked about the dark sword earlier on, here's another guy who, hang on, isn't this the guy who created the dark sword? You know? And I love doing things where it's a throwaway line. You know, in one of the modules, someone slips up and they start a word, but they don't complete the sentence, and then they keep talking. And if you're a player and you're what was that?
Right.
You know, and if you latch onto that, that's like a huge component of the story, right? That's untold. The story works without it. But if you latch onto that, you can actually, there's a subtle thread that's running through the whole thing, which is why this whole campaign is actually happening. And it's something you never actually have to reveal. And I think we had this discussion via Messenger, we were talking about it recently, where you don't actually need to tell anyone what's actually happening, because the role of the players is for them to find out what's happening in their own mind. So your explanation of what is happening is not as good as their explanation of what's happening. So rather don't tell them what's happening. And that's how we wrote the North Road. We basically had all the connections of how everything was working and why everything was doing the way we wanted, and they were removed all the links. And what's left is just all people talking about, what's this about? What's happening here? You know, how does this connect to that? Right? Yeah. We don't tell you, we don't summarize it. We don't give you any kind of backstory or anything. The module just starts. You walk off the boat, you meet a small child, and he starts talking about the woman run the show and blah, blah, blah. Like, what's going on? You know, what's this wizard weed stuff? You know, like, that's another whole plot thing, undercurrent that runs through 12 modules. What's that about? You know, why are there no guards? Where are the city guards? You know, like...
And that's a great template for designing a D&D adventure. because we started off this podcast talking about, what makes the best D&D adventure. How do you hook them early on so they don't wander aimlessly? Well, that's the brilliance of like the North Road. And you had told me this early on in our collaborations, that you really need to give the player someone to care about.
Yep.
Somebody to protect, right? Someone sympathetic. And so as I was writing Slay the Hawker, I'm thinking of that, like how I don't want to just give it away, but I'm trying to create a scene where it looks like this is a person that is on the eve of their wedding, and they're waylaid, they're ambushed, and I don't know, there's an opportunity to intervene against unfair odds. They are ambushed. So I think that those are the kind of things you put in front of players that it forces them to make a choice. I mean, they could ignore the plight of this little boy in the North Road, or they can step up and be a hero, so then things get complicated, and we keep posing more muddy ethical dilemmas. But once you've kind of committed, you kind of just see where it winds up.
The hard part is always getting them into the mud. Keeping them in the mud is easy. Just add more mud.
Yeah.
Yeah, but getting them to actually put their toe into the mud is really the hardest part. And you kind of have to, they don't realize that they're walking into it. They kind of have to be sleepwalking into the adventure, really. And that's why I think it's when we talked about earlier, where you don't want to directly tell them, like, you've got to go all the way to the White Castle and, save the kingdom. It's like, okay, you've just railroaded the entire thing.
I'm sort of perplexed about people's critiques these days about, some of those classic TSR modules, like the Keep on the Borderlands. I think that is actually a really good template for designing a D&D module. Some people say, oh, there's no narrative to it. It's just a bunch of random, and it doesn't make sense for the local ecology, just all these monsters just strewn about the same cavern complex. But I don't understand those complaints too well, because, well, for one thing, if we imagine that ravine of the caverns of chaos, the caves of chaos, being ginormous, and it's a network of tunnels that are connected by some secret passages, well, is it too unreasonable to suppose that some goblinoid tribes are kind of rough neighbors? There's some uneasy alliances, but there's definite friction between them. They're not knocking on each other's doors asking to borrow the sugar or something. I mean, they're roughly in the ballpark of the type of monsters. You got an oddball owlbear or ogre in there, but to me it makes a kind of sense that they're populating this cavernous, riddled cliff area. And then in the very back of the cave complex is the Temple of Chaos. And it's really sinister. And it's a great climax. If you read that module from beginning to end, I think Gygax is a great writer. He's demanding, but if you are attentive, you see this dramatic things building up to a crescendo in it with this treacherous evil priest. He's a regular hanging out in the tavern in the keep where it's supposed to be safe and everything. But, he offers to help you out, but you don't know when he's going to double cross you. Those are spoilers. I'm sorry. But
it has been out for like 40 years.
Yeah, I know. But that's the problem. I don't think people actually read it. It's great. It has a lot of great potential. I think the drawback, if there is one, is that it is written for that early style of dungeon crawl play. It's very open world. It's sandboxy, and it assumes that you're in a gaming club that has a lot of expendable time. I don't, and I think a lot of people nowadays, our time is even more precious than ever. When we get together with our gaming groups, like we've got to get to the interesting parts and kind of soft pedal, get those transition parts instead of role playing every nitty gritty step. With Gygax, you've got all these interesting people dwelling in the keep, and he describes them, how much money they have, their motives, but it's all just the info dump,
Yeah.
right? And so what you don't get with Gygax is what we're trying to do in our Quest Givers module there. And so I wanted to provide in Slay the Hawker a home base like that, a castle complex where you're safe, basically, for the most part. You've got what you need there, but I wanted more of what Gygax didn't give us. He's got a constable. He's got a lot of medieval flavor in the infrastructure of the keep, but you just roll to see if this constable happens to be in the tavern on any given day. I wanted narrative driven adventure where the players are swept up in an unfolding series of events like you talked about earlier. The structure of the module is, like there's episodes, like chapters or novel or acts of a play, and then there's events which are different from scenes. The events, like you described, are going to go on around the characters regardless. It's the machinations of the villains, it's the wedding, it's the holidays, the things that are in the culture that will happen regardless of player choices. Yep. Those are the major events within the episodes. And then the scenes are where the players make choices that affect the world, and they have actions and results, choices and consequences, and we play it round by round, right?
Yeah.
So what Gygax didn't give us was that sense that you wake up in the castle and here's the daily life, the feastal pomp and ceremony of chivalry, and you're surrounded, you're immersed in it, and you can choose to be part of the intrigues, the marauding forces of chaos. You can set out with the Lord of the Keep, to check the advance of the enemy if you want, or you can stay in the tavern. But those opportunities are there laid out for you, and you get to taste the great hall and that daily life in a culture of chivalry. That was my idea. Now they've slid into a dark ages, but they're desperate to hang on to those vestiges of chivalry, and you can help out if you want.
I mean, my thought on why it doesn't feel like there's a narrative structure to old modules like that is because you're actually reading it as a GM, and it's not reading like a game. It's reading like a recipe book. Add 3 eggs, put in a cup of flour, 2 spoons of sugar, like that. And honestly, who wants to read that? And that's why people will say, well, it's just, it's kind of a boring read. It's like, yes, because it is a boring read. It's not. The beauty of those modules are not the actual written text. It's what you actually do with that becomes great. But I think where Scotty and I differed, what we didn't want to do, we didn't want to just give you, because most things will just give you, here's all the world building bits and pieces. Now you go off and create a story. That's the easiest thing in the world to write. Here we go. Here's a bullet point list of everything you need. But actually, how does this all connect together? How do I write something which, in a sense, is like a fighting fantasy or choose your own adventure? It's very close. It's very close to a text adventure. That's why I think you got into it quite easily, because you're kind of in that mode already. But you need those sort of narrative things. You need the kind of, it's not a novel, it's a play. And the actors are your players, and you're playing them like they're instruments in an orchestra. And so you're conducting, and you're going, okay, we need a little bit more drums and a little bit more trombone and a little bit more of this, And so you're orchestrating all these things, and then you're dropping problems in front of them as you go. And really, that's what I feel a module should be. If you're going to write a great module, you need to give the whole gamut of everything. Now, they're only going to play like 20% of the content, but you can play that module again, because the next time you play it, they're going to run it a completely different way. And with the North Road, every adventure, although it's part of the whole story, every adventure is a different type of role-playing experience. There's like the puzzle version, there's the chase scene version, there's the murder mystery, there's a political intrigue. So people who like those kind of things, they can take away that aspect of it and use that again in a different. They can just take that module and use it in a completely different game and change the characters' names.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. That's all really needs to be done. But that's how I personally feel, and Scotty, I know, feels this way as well. That's how a module should actually be written. Because when I'm reading something, I want to enjoy it as much as the players are enjoying it, right? I'm like, I want to run this. And imagine if they actually don't find this, there's so much here that they're going to miss, or, it would be cool if they go down this route or if they go down that route. And you can read it. You could basically read it like a choose your own adventure or fighting fantasy, where you can go, well, I'll just ignore that and I'll move on to the next one.
Well, and I think that's the genius of your design for your QuestGiver modules. It visually reinforces that kind of interactive gameplay. So you're sort of simulating that for yourself as a GM as you read through the module. And I think it just sticks with you more. Like, what's coming next. When you sit down to run it at the table, you've kind of programmed your mind because of the document design. It kind of sets you up to think in that way. You can visually see not just the flavor text, the subheadings, and it's all kind of color coded so that we know this is a little bit of instruction for the GM, but this is the NPCs talking. We can tell whose voice we're looking at. It helps you remember how the game should go, what's coming next for the players.
World building and making a D&D campaign, part of it is document building. How do you put together a document so that it gets this effect? It's not just bullet points, it's not just, if you formulate it in this way, people will look at a document and go, well, it's just a wall of text. So you kind of, when you break it out into a specific way of actually showing, like, this is the question that the person has asked, and here's all the dialogue, and then there's another bubble that says, if this happens, go to page 7 or whatever, go to this chapter. So you get into the mode of you're thinking about it in a logic. There's the logic sort of part of your brain is ticking over, and your if and or statements, X or, is all working like a computer program. Because you really are programming the players and programming the GM to think in a very specific way. It'd be very difficult to run one of our modules where the players don't ask the NPCs questions. But there's never a moment where something is not, where something's not said that wouldn't basically prompt, hang on a minute, what's that about? You ask the guy the question, what are you talking about the chalice? And then he gives you a response. And then in that response is more tidbits of information. And the way we write is, like, if we want to limit the amount of time they have, like, the guy only gives 2 responses out of 20. So it really depends on which questions you ask, and you've got to ask the right questions. But every question, every answer has something different in it. And now it's like, if you play this module again, it's a completely different game, right? You could actually take the same group of people through the module twice and they wouldn't play it the same way. And I think that's what's super important. And that's why, you don't have a railroad when you could play it again and do it completely different. Then it's not a railroad, because then you have volition. Then your choices actually matter. What you've done actually matters to the story. And players get that feeling of accomplishment and that they've actually achieved something, which is why volition is more important than agency. Because once you have volition, you have them, and you'll keep having them all the way to the end. When you're thinking about your campaigns, break it up into the session, and each session should be a different type of experience, so that you're not just redoing the same thing over and over and over again. And we kind of do that in this module because there's 7 days essentially in this module. And each day is a kind of different experience. There's always something interesting happening. You're doing a cavern crawl in this one, and then you're doing a hunt in this one. You're doing a jousting competition in there, and then you're doing like this madcap chase. You need all of those kind of elements. So even though this is one module, it's really about 4 sessions in total, of which you can mix it up as you go. And so you've got these wonderful kind of role-playing experiences. And also don't be afraid to inject new mechanics for things that, like, oh, well, if you're writing specifically for a game, so if you're writing for D&D and it doesn't have jousting mechanics, make it up. Put it in there, because that's another thing that makes your module interesting, and also arguably an item people would want to purchase because it has that kind of added extra in it.
Those are the distinctives of this module that just where within the revision and the collaboration process, that's where it just really shines. I mean, that's the kind of game I always wanted to play. With D&D, its roots are rogues and thieves, right? Dungeon crawling. You're basically playing a Tomb Raider with
you're plundering.
D&D. Yeah, and you would see illustrations in the old TSR books of guys wearing knightly garb and armor, but where's the knighthood? Where's the chivalry? And I wanted a little bit more of that. So what would it be like to take part in a joust, but a fantasy joust? And you really helped to flesh out. I had some rules that I cobbled together to make that tournament, but you really helped flesh that out into a game within the game. And I just think this module we've made is just packed with different types of game that happen throughout the week. It's events that they're going to happen around the characters regardless of what the players choose. And you can get swept up in that if you want. And they're trying to fulfill this prophecy. And that's why these wedding traditions of chivalry must take place each day of the week. The beauty is you can play a part in that and save this little corner of the universe.
I mean, we've talked about it before, but the power of non-player characters and dialogue, I think, is really the thing that your module was very good to begin with just a minor amount of editing in the right art, and would have been a great product. But I think when you actually add in the NPC dialogue, that just launches it. It dials it up to 11. And it really, and it's not like I went through and wrote the dialogue. I just basically said, here are the things you need to talk about. Go forth and write. Yeah. And then, then it's just a matter of tweaking. You need a collaboration, whether the person is actually wanting to be involved in it, and, to the extent that I was, or they're just there to say, well, what if, and what's happening here. You need that person to kind of like rein you in or let you loose to kind of explore, because really you came to me with 50% of the module. And through adding the new mechanics and adding the dialogue and everything like that, we've created what it should be. It's kind of, I don't want to say that it was lacking, because it wasn't lacking. It was really good to begin with, and it had all the flavor and all that sort of thing. And I was like, it's like reading about how a juicy roast tastes rather than eating a juicy roast. And I wanted to take it from the reading about it to actually, and that's that experience of reading the module as the GM. I'm going to have to put this in front of players. You also want the GM to feel like they're confident in that they can actually do this. And I think that's what's also important in terms of the way that it's structured. It's like it kind of says, don't worry, we've got your hand. So if you're a new GM, you just have to do it basically in order. But if you're an experienced GM, you can play around with things and move things around and add a character here and do all that sort of. So it's open enough to allow and facilitate all that sort of stuff. And I think that's super, super important.
Yeah, when you read all those dialogue boxes, they're like sound bites. And I mean, if you want to just read straight through, you could run it that way. But more importantly, it gets those voices of the different kind of people who populate this world in your head, so that you know who inhabits the realm, what they care about, and then you can kind of paraphrase it. You can improv as much as you want, but you know you got a good sense of who's there already.
And like the way that the the farmers speak is different from the way that the king speaks. So the GM gets, oh well, there's sort of a very sort of lowbrow, halting kind of speak versus a very languished, very regal and
Yeah.
drawn out, like the way I speak. Just shut up, man. Keep going. That's the players see that there's a difference in the characters, and it's not just one person reading some lines. You, as the GM, become a better GM because you've gotten more dynamic characters, and the world. You feel like you can actually touch the walls, and you can sense things that are going on. It's not real. It's not real, but you get a sense that there's actually something going on here, and there's more to it, and that more to it that's the thing. Because we don't explain what's going on, the players put that there's more to it in their head, and the GM can then, if he wants to or she wants to, just insert extra little bits and pieces, because now they've read everything, they can kind of get a sense of what should and should not be in it. They can, add and subtract as they wish.
And that collaboration that you've talked about, you've emphasized that, and I totally agree. I think that's the most fun part of designing one of these adventure modules. I think the real writing happens in the revision, and I really think that because, like you were saying, sometimes you would push me on something and say, I'm not really sure that's going to work. And I would have to think through it and say, well, maybe you're right. But what if what if we put it in because of this, and we made sure the GM knows that, and then you said, okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So we were making it better, and that collaboration is essential. I really think you need that, because we weren't yes men for each other. It was, it was good. We're testing it out constantly.
Yeah, I mean that, and the testing part of it, although, you were actually running it at conventions and things like that. So you were getting, the jousting thing, and you were kind of getting the feel for how this actually works. It's all theoretical until you run your players through it and they stuff it up.
Yeah. I played it at different conventions, and then I had my group where I GM, and we ran through the whole thing. I had my regular dungeon master take us through it. So I've seen a variety of different players and what they want to do with it. And it can really be a long campaign. When my DM ran it, we had some people who really are into role playing, and it really took us several months, and we were playing once or twice a month only, but they would really want to prolong the interactions with the NPCs.
Yeah.
So it can be a really long campaign if you want.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is it's a fertile ground for entertainment. It's that go-to wellspring. Like I'd say Star Wars is one of those things. It's because you can keep going back to it, you can keep getting more out of it and changing and chopping it and doing all kinds of things. And so you're not creating just a static kind of object. You're actually creating something like, if I need to run a game, I have this thing I can always rely on to run. I can always rely on this part of the module, or if I'm coming up with a game and I need a jousting thing, I can always use that part of the module. When you're thinking about how to publish a D&D adventure, so you've got a variety of options here. I mean, it's never been a better time for self-published people to actually be doing it. Now, as quest givers, we do it ourselves through our own website. But for most people, you're going to have to go through like a drive-through RPG, or you put it through Amazon, or you're going to have to go through some kind of market. And I think what's important to realize there is that the more you kind of pigeon yourself into one sort of game, the more there is an expectation about what should be in it. There's like a history of D&D, like it must have magic items, and it must have D&D monsters, and it must have, like all these sort of tropey things that D&D modules always have. And if you're just copying what everybody else does, you haven't really given something new and unique. And I think the way to stand out, if you look at the things that are rising to the top of the list on Drive-Thru RPG, it's very important to look at the mithrils and the adamantians and everything that's sort of gold upwards in terms of sales. What is actually selling there? And if you want your stuff to get in front of a wider audience, it should be system neutral. That's what we focus on in terms of the actual. It doesn't target Dungeons and Dragons. It targets all fantasy. And then we can collaborate with small, because there's lots and lots of small games that are being written that, it's easy enough to write a game system, but how do you write a whole ton of modules to run that game through? That's the problem that you start to have. It's like you're one, maybe two people, and you've written this thing, and now you've got a thirsty audience of 10,000 people who've bought your thing, and now they want, okay, where are the modules? Because that's what they've been brought to expect by the big players. All right, they bring out a new book every 2 months. It's like, here's a new giant campaign for you to play. And you as a self-publisher, it'll take you 2 years to write a module or something, because you've got a day job. And that's where you kind of will fall down, is that as a game designer, as a person who's creating a game, it's like, how do you get the community involved to generate the content for you? And as quest givers, we notice that if you create system neutral content, you can easily go to Knave, which has just done well on Kickstarter, or Shadow Dark, that's just done well on Kickstarter. We have 20 Shadow Dark things you can play. We have 20 Knave things you can play. It doesn't matter. It all works. It's fantastic. Easy D6, ICRPG, D&D. It doesn't matter. All of them work.
Yeah, that's the beauty of the system neutral distinctive of these modules. That it kind of takes out a superfluous aspect of modules. I think you were alluding to just earlier, where if prepping for a game session usually involves tweaking the stat blocks anyway, then you could argue that that's the least useful part. Because, in fact, there's little tutorial PDFs you can download for free. Like there's one called Burning Goblins for new DMs, GMs, and players. And they tell you they don't even put the stat blocks in there because it would be kind of disruptive. There's sort of an appendix where if you want to look at that, you can. But I think I hear so much in the gaming community about how the game is different at every table, and everybody is going to have to tweak those stats. You're going to dial up or down to meet the kind of challenge rating that's appropriate for your table and the system. So I think it's really well done in the Quest Givers modules that I've read through, that you get a clear description of what the NPCs or the monsters can do and how do they attack. And so it's easy to just fill it in like I always do anyway with any module. And I'm not taking up valuable real estate inside the module with stat blocks that I'm just going to fidget with no matter what.
And things like, magical weapons and things like that. It's a sword and it does magical things. You tell me what it does. Ultimately, if a lightsaber, it's just a sword, right? Okay. And it's fancy. And that's all a magical weapon is. It's fancy. It does something fancy. So, but as far as the story goes, it doesn't make a difference. It really doesn't make a difference. If it's the key to unlock the whatever, then it's a key. It's not a sword.
Yeah. And the advantage was, like, when I ran it or I played it or ran it for different groups, my DM he knows 5e and he loves it, and he's a rules monger. He is going to play it rules as written. So, but he's so good at that that when he read the descriptions of what the woman, the witch, can do and her weird eccentric spells like in the movie, or the warlock or whatever, it's easy for him to drop in whatever stats because he knows that part of the game really well. Whereas I like to have more, the pulp fantasy. I use a system that's, I guess it's like Shadow Dark. It came out, 5 torches deep. And so I know kind of what 5e players want, but I like the more old school vintage TSR style. It's easy to bring that to the system neutral kind of adventures like this, whatever mechanics you prefer.
But also, when you do system neutral, you have to start thinking about mechanics that work in every game. And one of the things that I like is roll tables, and I feel that roll tables are always done poorly because they're just, here's a list from 1 to 10, roll a d10. But I'm always like, okay, well, if you take the same roll table and you said, in this situation, roll a d6, and in this situation, roll 2 d10s, it's the same table, but it actually changes the nuances of how the table actually works, and the results you're going to get are going to be different and flavorful in different, like if you had a roll table of wandering monsters, okay, and at night you've got to roll 3 dice, but during the day you only roll 1 dice, so that limits, the 1 dice is only going to be a certain number of monsters at the top. But then when you roll 3 dice, you've now opened up this whole section of other weird and wonderful creatures. It totally changes the dynamic of the actual roll table. And then you go, okay, well, if it's in winter, instead of rolling a d6, you're now going to roll d4s, which means you're never going to see the last few because they're all hibernating. And so the way that you construct your roll table, you don't have to have 50 roll tables. You have one roll table, but 20 different combinations of dice. And that's something that people do not do. They do not think about roll tables in a way which basically means you don't have to take up real estate in your, makers. Oh man, this book is just 30 pages of roll tables. It's one roll table with 30 different options.
Yeah, this module that we have got, it's packed with that kind of thing. And it's really, like you say, I think it's innovative. It makes me want to play it and try out those different possibilities using a different dice on that same roll table, depending on what the players have chosen and what path they took before they got here. And because it's going to be a different dungeon every time that way.
Well, as an example, you can go into the catacombs in this and, and it's just normal. You can go through, and the characters, if they don't make a map later on, if you've got no map, you have to then, it's a roll table. But if you have a map, then it's easy because you can, I know where this is, I know where that is. But otherwise it becomes a roll table and you're lost because the dynamics of the catacombs have changed. So if you get lost, and because it's a roll table, you could keep going back to the same place over and over and over again, but when you get to a certain place that's closer, you're then changing the dice that you're rolling, so you're not going to see all the sections where, you might have got lost in the 13 to 20 area and keep rolling d20s, but the moment you get into 11 or 12, you're now rolling d10s or d8s, so you're never going to see the other ones again, and you're still trying to find number 1, which is the place that you've got to go. Now, you could get there on the first roll, arguably, and in which case, fantastic. Still works. And yes, okay, you missed out on 20 fantastic locations where things are happening, but so is the luck of the roll, and if you're the GM and you go, well, I'm running out of time and I really need to finish this, you can just shortcut straight to number 1. That's what the options that it gives you. And so players having not done a thing changes the way the game works later on. And that's really cool. We did that in the North Road, where the final module, if you didn't do a thing in module 2, this happens. If you rescued this person in module 3, you now have this. And so all these things, if you actually did everything, it's going to be very easy. If you didn't do anything and you're just a murder hobo and kill everything, no one's going to help you. And now you've got this huge battle going on with no support. So that whole idea of volition and the fact that your choices matter, that's where, like, that's my whole sort of, I'm going to stick my flag at the top of this hill and I'm going to die there. Volition is where it is. Forget about agency. Volition.
Yeah. So the dungeon, it's got that dungeon crawl flavor to it, that classic, kind of, it satisfies that desire, but it also makes sense narratively. And so, yes, if the players acted shrewdly earlier, then they could get to that rescue scene. They could be there in time. And it really just depends on how much the GM wants to dial up the random factor. Do they want some of those cool scenes and encounters that are buried in the catacomb? There's nothing wrong with giving a plus or minus on a roll or whatever.
Picking and choosing rather than rolling. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, you do what makes sense to the narrative if you want it.
The players don't know why you're rolling. You're just rolling. Oh, it's a 7. That means... Yeah. I'm not hiding the roll. I'm just hiding how that roll actually works. So I don't fudge the die. I just fudge the mechanics behind what I've rolled.
Yeah, there's different ways to dial things. So,
Yeah. Joining me today is Jonathan B. Himes, Professor of English Literature and the Director of the Writing Center at John Brown University. He's also launching a game design program there. Thank you very much for joining me. This podcast is brought to you by Quest Givers, where you can get system-neutral modules. There's a variety of different things and RPG tips and tools, and also the book, The North Road, we have been talking about. And you will be able to get Slay the Hawker as well. So thank you, Jonathan, for joining me on this, and we will see you in the next one.
In every corner, swaying sides of misery. Roll your dice